Well, Phillip, I'm going to say hello, Mr. Holowka. So
Yes.
I say it right, Phillip Holowka. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Spencer.
Well, thanks for coming down, man. I know you're down here for other reasons. Appreciate you spending extra time with me and having some lunch too. Did you enjoy our lunch that we just had?
It was delightful. Yes.
Yeah,
The company was great. The food was wonderful. Yes.
Yeah, man. Yeah, well, I appreciate that. You don't have to say which one was better, the food or the company. But thanks for coming down, man. You're down from Pittsburgh, right?
Yes.
Pittsburgh. We were just talking about Pittsburgh Penguins,
Yes.
Pittsburgh Steelers. So Pittsburgh to Dallas. I mean, like when you had you come down to Texas office or no?
Yeah, we've got some clients in Texas.
Okay.
I enjoy coming south, especially for the wintertime.
Yeah, no, you're like a bird flying south for the winter. Right? Like you can't be. I've got this heavy coat on today, but it's going to be like 77 degrees, and that's the beauty of Texas is you literally never know. Like 2 years ago, freezing cold on Halloween. Last night, I go with my daughter to do trick or treating, and I'm in a t-shirt. Like, yeah, it's like what you never know what you're gonna get, man. Yep. But presuming it's gonna be warmer than Pittsburgh most of the time.
That's a very good assumption.
Yeah,
it's safe. Yes,
it's safe assumption. So so you're down here. Obviously, you're down here for another event, but today we're gonna dig into really deep into captives, and I kind of explained to you my vision that we'll do kind of a two-part series on captives because I feel like one, the space is very complex, but two, I think just based on kind of feedback I've been getting, the questions I've been getting from people in the market, I feel like there's a demand and appetite to understand captives pretty deeply. So
yes, we're going to get granular today.
We're going to get very granular. We're going to start basic so that we don't lose too many people, but we'll get pretty granular. But obviously, before we go too deep into that, I'd like to take a chance for the audience to get to know you. History, your background. We'll talk about you being an EMT, family, whatever you want to talk about is on the table. The floor is yours.
Well, I appreciate that, Spencer. So I'm married, going on 24 years.
Congrats.
I've got a wife that I'll say candidly I married up on. That's always important. But she's also in the stop-loss business.
Okay.
She is a pharmacist. She's a doctor of pharmacy. And so we have some pretty interesting conversations at our dinner table. Sometimes it pushes our kids away.
Yeah, I'm sure the kids aren't. That's probably like going way over their heads,
gosh.
right? Yeah.
So, but yeah, we've got some good conversations. So I'm excited to have those conversations. I have 3 wonderful kids. My oldest, who's 22, is following Mama's footsteps.
Nice.
She's in her 5th year of pharmacy school, so that's exciting. And then I have 2 high schoolers, 15 and 17. So they keep me busy, and we're very blessed that.
Well, I think we talked about this over lunch. Don't know if any of them are going to fall in the captive footsteps, right? Like, or they don't know yet that they have interest in the captive space.
That's right. I think my youngest daughter is very much attuned, I think, on what she wants to be when she grows up.
Okay, so your son's maybe the only possibility then, right?
My son is taken after my track of we're going to wait and see what pans out.
We'll figure it out, right?
Yes.
So that's what we talked about, wait and see, but obviously I think the relevant kind of history you have in your career pre-captive space was as an EMT. So tell me, how many years were you an EMT?
Oh, boy. I was 25 years as a paramedic.
25, okay.
And I'll tell you, Spencer, if there was a direct route to where I am today, and then there was a ziggity-zaggity route that is all over the place, that was the route that I took.
So how did you get interested in being a paramedic in the first place?
Oh, boy. So at a very early age, almost like my youngest, I wanted to be a physician.
You did? Okay.
I found it fascinating to practice medicine. And at a very high level, I enjoyed helping people, right? So I went into college to go to medical school, but I took a year off. I attended paramedic training. And that got me an entry-level position on the ambulance to practice medicine. And to say I have stories to write a book is an understatement.
I believe it.
So... But when I should have been focusing on biology and chemistry and calculus, I was running paramedics on the streets of Pittsburgh.
Okay.
And I lost that focus. I did graduate, by the way, but I should have been focusing on schoolwork.
Well, so what was the allure then? Is it the fact that you could hit the ground running working, or was it the excitement? I mean, what? Tell me about what draws you to be a paramedic?
All of the above. To say it was exciting is an understatement. And you know, medicine is fascinating because there's very seldom is the right answer right in front of you, right? So you have to be part detective when you're a paramedic because you have to question a patient. What's your ailments? What's going on? What's your signs? What's your symptoms? Those sort of things. So that was the exciting part of it. And I wanted to be a physician, and I was living what I thought was my dream at the time. And one of the distractions was I was making a wage of an adult. I was 19, and so I was distracted. But becoming a paramedic was probably one of the better things in my life because it was just the excitement got me.
Well, you spent 25 years, right? I mean, that's a lot of excitement. So I don't have to put you on the spot necessarily, but if there's any story, like a favorite story, favorite thing, I mean, maybe not. I know there's obviously some traumatic things that you experience. You probably see people obviously at the worst moments of their lives, but I mean, anything that jumps out to you that might be an interesting one you can share?
Well, I mean, where do I start? Working in EMS has challenges just like every other career, but it's like working in a coal mine. You take those things home with you. And the waxing and weaning of emergency medicine, you have to have a good family circle, support group, because you take home some of the tragedies that happened during that workday. But by and large, it was all good, right? So some of the funny stories, and it may look dark whenever I talk about this, but it has a good ending.
Okay.
I remember going to the hospital one early morning for, we'll call her Margaret, sick, not feeling well. So on the way to the hospital, she has, what looks to be almost like a seizure. Okay. And I say, Margaret, are you okay? And she's not responding. And I look up at the heart monitor, and her heart's not doing what it should be doing.
Okay.
In fact, it's what's called ventricular fibrillation. So effectively, it's a non-sustaining heart rhythm, and it's corrected pretty easily. You have to get up the paddles, right? You got a shocker, and that's what I did. However, when this happened, picture me now. I'm straddling the stretcher. My legs are on both sides of the stretcher, which are in the middle of the ambulance.
Okay.
And I holler up to my partner who's driving the ambulance. I say, Jim, she's in cardiac arrest. So just picture me for a second. I'm holding the paddles here. I'm getting ready to charge her to defibrillate her. What does he do? He steps on the gas. So if you can just picture me, I'm holding these paddles.
Not holding on to anything.
Not
right?
holding on to anything else. And I fly back to the end of the ambulance. So I reacquaint myself and I say, Jim, you gotta call a hospital, because I said we were coming in with Margaret, who's just sick, and now she's not breathing. And hospitals tend not to like those patients who come in at a surprise.
Yeah.
So Jim gets on the radio and says to Mercy Hospital, hey, we're coming in with a full cardiac arrest. And then the doctor on the other side says, well, is there any other type of cardiac arrest other than a full cardiac arrest, right?
Yeah.
It's almost like being half pregnant.
Yeah.
You can't be half pregnant. So the good thing of the story is I shocked her. She came back to life, and she was living whenever I left the hospital. But, some of the crazy things about EMS is some of the simple things, right? I saved her. She was dead.
Yeah.
And a simple tact, a simple effect brought her back.
Well, that's what's, when alluring from the outside looking in is like, I'm sure you have obviously both ends of the spectrum of the outcome, but the moments where, I literally intervened and either brought somebody back or prevented them from dying. I presume you probably had some people ever follow up with you, right? Or like, thank you, or is there, it's okay. So are they aware of you? Okay. So that's gotta be rewarding in and of itself.
Well, it's rewarding because, the times where you say to a patient, nothing's gonna happen to you on my watch.
Yeah.
And that sounds cliche. I mean, oh yeah, every paramedic has said that. Well, it means something.
Yeah. And,
to this day, it's sort of like tears me up sometimes because I did that, and not just once, but hundreds of times.
Yeah.
And, the problematic calls of kids and, traumatic events, the blood and guts, that's probably 1 out of 1,000 calls that I went to. But 99% of the other calls were just someone needed help in their time of need.
Yeah.
And that was me.
Well, I can tell just by listening to you talk, obviously, the impact it's had on your life. And I appreciate you doing, 2.5 decades of this work, right?
Yes. It's a young man's game.
It's a young man's game. So, at that point, though, obviously, you spent the bulk of your career and your adult life as a paramedic. Then you decide, what, I don't want to do this anymore, or what happens?
Well, like I mentioned, it's a young man's game, right? So
is it normal to age out of that profession then, or move on? Is there a transition out of it to do something else along the same path, I guess?
Yes, just management. You graduate into the management of a system. Okay. But one of the challenges with EMS, it's not very vertically inclined, right? So there's not too much advancement opportunities. And you're lifting patients, you're pulling patients, you're doing other things with patients, and it's taxing on your body. So I was probably 40 years old at the time, and I said, I can't do this for another 10 years. And I got into an ambulance association, and that association did like group purchasing for supplies, and we started a multiple employer retirement plan.
Okay.
So that's what kind of was the graduation outside of the street work and into something that I could do just for ambulance companies.
Did you like the administrative side as much as being on the front lines, or was it good to maybe de-stress a little bit from that? Or
well, truth be told, I did EMS part-time whenever I was doing this. Yes.
Okay.
You what's the saying? You can take the guy out of the country, but you can't take the country out of the guy.
Yeah.
Same thing. So I stayed in it and dabbled with it over the weekends. So that was my weekend.
Couldn't get enough. And most people just watch football on the weekends. Here you are being a paramedic. But I appreciate the fact that it's kind of in you, right? It's part of who you are. And I guess it's the same as like a pro athlete that, eventually when their time has come and they leave their sport that they've dedicated 20-something years to, it's like, can you really ever remove them from the sport? Exactly. It's got to be tough. So of course, we alluded to at the beginning of our discussion, we're going to talk about captives today, but I'm curious, you go from full-time EMS to part-time EMS and doing the administration and the association, then what? Where did captives come in?
That was the zag and the whole zig and zag thing that I did. So, the multiple employer retirement plan that we started, those employers said, Phil, this multiple employer retirement plan works. It's saving cost on the administration. It's saving cost on the investments for the employees. It's working great, but we're getting killed by health insurance. Now, this was 2008, mind you. Okay. And I think if you go back to 2008, I think a single rate was about $250 a month.
People always talk about this, and I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah, my gosh.
I wasn't around for those days, unfortunately.
So the association that I was with said, hey, can you find a solution like the retirement plan, but for insurance, health insurance? Of course, I work for you guys, so of course I want to do that. So I went out to all of the major managed care networks, and I said, hey, we got thousands of employees here. What if we all brought our business to you? And each of those carriers said, no thanks. It was a struggle. So that option wasn't available. Then we went down to the multiple welfare arrangement, MIWA.
MIWA, yeah.
And that's poison. You don't want to touch that, right now. That's not a good thing. So that was out. And then we came to this captive solution, and that's got interesting.
Okay.
So those association members said, yeah, let's look at this.
So who brought that idea to the table for you? You went through your investigation, but was there somebody that you reached out to initially that said, hey, captives is what you should explore?
Yes. So we reached out to a couple consultants. We vetted the field because there were a lot of, not a lot, maybe 3 or 4 consultants that said, this is probably the best option for you. So we landed with one consultant, and he said, for this thing to take off, you need to brand it. You need to have an identity.
Okay.
What are you going to call yourself? So we had to look for a name. And that was a process, Spencer, because, were we going to be a catchy name? Is it going to be down to earth, real, focused name? And I said, I don't know what the name of it's going to be, but when I hear it, I'll know it. Right? And one of the consultants said, how about just MedTrans?
For medical transit, right?
Medical transportation.
Or transportation, right?
Yeah.
Okay. MedTrans. Okay, interesting.
And it just stuck.
Yeah.
And that's when MedTrans.
Well, that's like naming your kid, right? Like you throw a bunch of names out, and eventually you're like, that's it. And your wife is like, yep, I agree. And you come to, so MedTrans was born out of that. Yep. So you guys started MedTrans as the mechanism in order to build a captive for this association? Is that how that worked?
Yes. Okay. So the captive itself, and I'm jumping ahead of myself, but the captive was a group captive. Okay. And at the time, the domicile that we wanted to work with, we were the first medical stop-loss captive in that domicile. But we filed for our license. We retained all of the service providers to do what we needed to do. And early April of 2010, we received our license.
Okay. And so what did you have, or who was the person you were leaning on to kind of explain this, right? Because obviously you didn't come to the table with the knowledge you have today. So was there a consultant, or who were you leaning on to educate you on this space?
So it was multi-pronged because, the captive consulting was really specialized. So we retained a consultant for that. And then there was this self-funded health plan. And at the time, I was Series 7 licensed and 66 in life accident and health license. But even then, I didn't have the sophistication on self-funding because that's a craft in itself, right? So I even brought in another guy to help us with the self-funding portion of it.
Okay.
So it was multi-pronged, presenting to the members of this association.
Well, and I mean, I think it speaks to the level of sophistication, which we're obviously going to dive deep into in a moment. So anything before we move on to kind of get into the jargon, the MedTrans of its inception, kind of understand how this was born out of, or should we move on to the...
Yeah, I think now's as good a time as any, but the concept of the group captive was still relatively new and unproven.
Yeah.
And that was one of the challenges of this project of you try to sell a concept that hasn't been vetted out with the market yet, because this is 2010.
Do we know when the first captive was born? I mean, you said 2010 was early, so do we know when the first one was?
Yeah, I've seen multiple 2008, 2009, 2010, but it was in those.
Is there somebody out there claiming, I was the first one to do it, or...
I'm going to leave that to them.
Okay, fair enough, right? Like, it's a very competitive space, too, the captive space. Yes. I get, and fair enough. So 2010 was still early stages, right? And you're putting together this captive for this association. Talk to me about the barrier to entry to that, and I think that'll segue into our conversation about the jargon. Like, you learning as you go. Tell me what that experience was like.
Boy, if there was ever a time that I made myself look out to be a buffoon is when I tried to talk about captive insurance when I shouldn't have been.
Yeah.
Right. So I had to rely upon the service providers to help me with that. And like we've had conversations, you hear it so many times over and over again, you just start picking it up.
Yeah.
But the problem was the consultant that we retained, when we would crisscross America saying, hey, trust us, this project will work. He wasn't with us. It was the guy that I started this with. He was with us, and it was a real challenge to convince people to trust us, right? Yeah, so
I can imagine. I'm just thinking about what it would be like to go out if I were tasked with to go explain captives with a very minimal understanding of it, or at least experience, right, exposure to it.
Yes.
That would give me heartburn.
It was tough.
Yeah,
and most importantly, it was expensive.
Yeah,
right, because. We got our license in April of 2010. We put our first group in August 1st of 2010. So there were 6 months there of, I hope this works, right? Because, we're spending money on something that at the end of the day, I didn't have any ownership of. MedTrans is owned by the members, 100%, and it's governed by the members. So even today as a service provider, I could get terminated if I don't do my job.
Yeah.
And that's the way it should be. The captive manager, who I am now, that's a service provider, and when you join a captive, that service provider is no different than the auditor. If you don't do your job, then you should have consequences for that.
Well, I think we call that a proper alignment of incentives, right?
That's right.
Yeah. So you're traversing the country. This is obviously pre-Zoom in 2010. So you're having to physically go out to all these locations. How many plane trips were you taking during that period of time? Was it every day?
I had status very quickly. Let's put it that way.
Fair enough. You said United, right? Is your plane of choice. So let's get into the jargon, because I think that's something we need to spend some time, the basics, right? Like I always talk about on this podcast, insurance is so full of jargon. None so more than I think stop loss, but I think captive rivals it to a degree. So can we talk some terms, right? Like,
I'd love to.
In the very beginning, I think captive manager probably is a place to start, and then I'll go down through the laundry list. But I want to spend some time defining it. Even if this is maybe boring for some folks, at least we define the terminology we're going to use for the rest of the conversation. So captive manager, what is that?
And I'll even go one up. A captive.
A captive, let's start there. Let's start at what is a captive?
What is a captive?
Even better.
So fundamentally, a captive, by definition, is a private insurance company. Okay? So you have the commercial carriers, which are... they can sell insurance policies to the public. Okay. The captive can only sell or place an insurance policy to its owner or subscriber or member. Okay. So private insurance company is what a captive is really called.
What is it? Does the captive term mean? I mean, like you say, it's private insurance, but what makes it captive? What is being captive at that point? The risk itself, or did I jump ahead?
No. Okay. So you're asking about the history of the label.
Yeah, captive. I'm curious where that terminology came from.
So the history of captive started out of a mining company.
Ah.
And the mining company was having struggles placing insurance, and the mine was a captive mine.
Okay.
Okay. So the word captive was born out of just the term of the mining company and how they mined the ore out of the earth. It's a captive mine.
So that's the origins of it.
That's the origins.
Interesting. Oh, dude, I appreciate you know. I'm glad I asked, and you're like, I have no idea, Spencer. Yeah, that was good. So born out of a mining company, we talked about a captive is a private insurance company.
Yes.
Okay. So then that could lead us in. Anything else we need to know on that? Okay. So captive manager then, obviously people can guess what that is, but tell me what their actual blocking and tackling, what they're doing as a captive manager.
So a captive manager really sort of replaces the commercial carrier's operations of that insurance company. Because remember, the commercial stop loss carrier has to report financial results to the board or shareholders, right? In a private insurance company, there's no shareholders per se. It's the members. So the captive manager's role in a captive is really the go-between between the client, the member of the captive, and the regulators. Because every captive has what's called a domicile.
Okay.
And a domicile is where the captive calls home. And within the United States, there's probably 40 captive domiciles.
Okay.
So you can take your pick, laundry list of captive domiciles. Some are better than others, right? It's, you know, if your ambition is to go to Hawaii for a board meeting, then maybe you want to be domiciled in Hawaii.
Okay.
But generally they're all the same, but each has their own little twerk. So the captive manager does all the regulatory affairs for that captive to report to the captive domicile.
Okay. So all the regulators, I mean, so is it safe to say they're an administrator, kind of like a
Very safe to
TPA is the administrator of the medical plan? Okay. So a captive manager is helping manage the plan, choosing where it's domiciled. I get pushing and pulling money, or are they doing that? Is that the carrier? If there's a front, we'll get into fronting carrier in a moment, but yeah. So,
but the captive manager is largely an accounting mechanism.
okay. Okay.
Very largely.
So a lot of captive managers have accountants on staff or
Very
CPAs
much so.
on staff. Okay.
Yes.
And did they get lumped into as an SIC code an accounting firm, or any idea there?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
I'll get back to you.
Good. I stumped you. Yes, I did it. No. So we often hear about group captives. I realize that's, I think that's the more popular form of a captive.
Yes.
There's also single parent captive. So define what is the contradiction or the opposition to those two terms there?
So Medtrans started as a group captive.
Okay.
And the reason group captives evolved in the medical stop loss side is because workers' comp group captives were around for years and decades before medical stop loss. And I think that the playbook from the group workers' comp captive just kind of fell into the laps of the medical stop loss arena.
I see.
Now, group workers' comp captives have to be fronted by a commercial carrier.
Okay.
I'm jumping ahead of myself. So a group captive, by definition, is one tax ID number, one captive.
Okay.
And then you have multiple employers or participants or members subscribe to the captive.
Okay.
Okay.
And they can be homogeneous and heterogeneous
That's right.
as well. So you want to explain those terms as well?
So homogeneous is the same like SIC code.
Yeah.
Okay. And then heterogeneous is any class. Now, workers' comp captives, you have to be generally homogeneous because of that, the pricing of the workers' comp captives. But with medical stop loss, you don't have to be because cancer doesn't know professions.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So it doesn't have to be.
Hey, do you know kind of rough numbers? What percentage are heterogeneous versus homogeneous? Like, is it one more popular than the other in terms of group cells?
I don't know that answer. From experience, generally, what I like to call verticals. Some captives will have like verticals of just manufacturers.
I see. Yeah.
Right. Because it's easier to start a group captive with a vertical because there's greater fraternal effects in a homogeneous captive. Right. Because a bricklayer wants to do business with another bricklayer on this space.
Well, and the risk profile of the employer is similar, right? So if you're looking into cost containment and controlling claims, like, hey, we know we experience this, you likely experience this type of consumption or claim as well. Okay, so that makes sense. So that's group captive.
Yep.
Now we've got single parent.
Single parent.
Tell me what a single parent captive
So
is.
Medtrans changed its structure in 2016 to what's called a single parent captive.
Okay.
So by definition, a single parent means the captive has one owner, and that owner is usually a business. It could be an individual, but it's usually a business. And in our model, each employer gets their own single parent captive.
Okay.
And there's several benefits to that which we find more attractive than the group model. One of those benefits, and I don't want to get too granular too quick, but accounting is favorable.
Okay.
So when an employer joins or is a participant of a single parent captive, they are paying for stop loss premium from this pocket, their corporation, and that money is deposited into their own captive.
I see.
Okay. So the employer picks up an expense over here, picks up an asset over here that are equal.
Okay.
And through what's called consolidation, financial statement consolidation, you can consolidate the captive's financials and the corporation's financials.
I see. Okay.
You can't do that in a group captive because consolidation is only allowed if you own 51% of an entity.
Okay. So that makes sense. So there tax advantages, I guess you could say, or it's not necessarily tax.
It's not necessarily tax. It's you're picking up an expense and you're picking up an equal asset, and they offset each other.
Okay, I see. Interesting. So okay, so and obviously we'll dive deeper, and for those of the folks that are listening, of course, listen back if we go too fast.
Yes.
Phil obviously is a wealth of knowledge, but this is not something anybody's going to understand in an hour. That's why I'm doing a second part to this as well. But I think it's deserving of spending this level of time, and then we'll make sure people know how to get a hold of you afterwards as well.
Yes.
So we did mention momentarily fronting carrier, fronting carrier and fees. Fronting fees kind of go hand in hand. So what is a fronting carrier then?
So a fronting carrier is a commercial stop loss carrier in this example. So the captive enters into what's called a reinsurance agreement between the captive and the carrier. Okay. That reinsurance agreement defines how risk is ceded and paid for.
Okay.
So the fronting carrier's job is to really do all of these stop loss administration services.
Okay.
And so to some degree, you join a group captive, you're really outsourcing all of that stop loss operation to a commercial carrier. In a direct writer model, we don't have a fronting carrier. A single parent model, I should say. Our model is my office, the captive management firm, does all of the operations that the commercial stop loss carrier does.
Okay. Well, so you use the term direct writer. I want to make sure, because I know the term direct writer as a stop loss carrier who writes on their own paper and assumes their own risk versus an MGU. So a direct writer in this space, tell me how that differs in terminology.
Sure. So in the group captive, the fronting carrier is issuing the client the stop loss policy.
So a Sun Life or an HCC or Berkeley or somebody like that. Okay.
So the client is effectively buying a commercial stop loss policy.
Okay.
And in our model, the direct writer, the client's captive, the single parent captive, is issuing the stop loss policy to the employer.
Okay.
So we don't have our medical stop loss policy is written for the benefit of the client.
I see. But they're in turn, the captive itself is absorbing the risk, right? Or assuming the risk.
That's right.
Okay. Instead of risk shifting over to the stop loss carrier to a degree. Am I saying that right appropriately, or what did I mess up on?
Finish your thought.
That was the end of my thought. So I didn't say it correctly. So tell me where I was wrong there.
No. Had you finished your thought, yes, there is risk shifting and risk distribution with our model.
Okay.
Now, in the group model, all of the risk shifting and sharing happens at the commercial carrier level. In our model, the single parent captive is sharing risk with other single parent captives in what's called a risk pool. Okay. The risk pool shares risk at different levels,
different layers of
different
stop
layers.
loss, yep.
And our risk pool is what we like to call a FIFO inventory accounting methodology.
First in, first out, right?
There you go, my friend. See, you're picking this stuff up.
I am, man. I'm learning as we go.
So when the employer pays stop loss premium, that cash goes into their captive.
Okay.
If they incur a stop loss claim, that cash to pay that stop loss claim comes out of that client's captive first. Okay. So what that means is the client is very attentive on what comes out of their captive.
Sure.
Because it's no different than, hey, I've got this, Bank of America bank account for my corporation. And guess what? I've got a Bank of America bank account for my captive too. I own that.
Okay.
So which pocket do I pay the stop loss claim from? So there's a whole lot more. Hey, is that claim legitimate?
Yeah.
Is that the right claim for the right amount? So there's a lot of scrutiny that goes on.
Well, a lot of scrutiny. I think we were talking, well, I don't know if we were at Saya talking about this, but where there's also the thought process, do I always maybe want it paid, right? Do I want the stop loss? If it's not a huge catastrophic risk, is it maybe something we choose not to? And we can explain the mechanics maybe further down the line, but whether or not you even want it to reimburse a claim, correct? And did I understand that correctly?
So,
we might have been drinking at the time a little bit, just a beer, but.
So you're asking a timely question.
Yeah.
Right? So if a captive has incurred a claim, that you're going to want to pay the claim, right? Because that's one of the triggers that the IRS doesn't like, and rightfully so. I mean, so if your captive has incurred a $100,000 claim from one of your employees, you want your captive to pay that claim, because if you don't, then you're sort of venturing into the area that the IRS doesn't like about these types of captives. Okay. However, if your policy is 12 months, most commercial stop loss carriers say if you file a claim on October 1st, it's got to be really paid. We don't want to sit on a claim. We want to pay it. So there's timing incentives with our model that isn't necessarily there for a commercial carrier.
Okay. So
or even a group captive.
The timing to pay sooner, or?
That's right.
It is. Okay.
That's right.
But you said also there's perhaps a higher level of scrutiny because it's their own funds at the same time.
That's right.
Okay.
So what we're getting into here is, and we're again jumping in front of ourselves a little bit.
That's okay. Yeah.
But our captives have an opportunity to elect a favorable tax election. Okay. And that tax election is what we like to say is a lever to lower your cost of health insurance.
Okay.
And we'll touch upon this in a minute, but our position is health insurance is crazy expensive right now. If we can get a hold of these crazy expenses, we wouldn't need to leverage this favorable tax election. So we'll save that for an entire other session.
Yeah.
But
well, that's a symptom, right? I mean, you're addressing a symptom of the root problem, which is the expense of healthcare is astronomical. So getting us back on track, because I want to make sure we don't go too far in the weeds, and at least define some of these terms we're going to use later. So we talked about fronting carrier, but what about the fronting fee?
So the fronting fee it's a replacement of the underwriting profits that the commercial carrier is now not going to. They're losing them.
So underwriting profits, whether their margin or whether they're building in
the
for
profit.
Yeah.
So just think for a second. Very simple. If a commercial carrier collects $1 million of premium, okay, and they have 700,000 of claims, and part of those claims there's 100,000 of operational SG&A expenses. That means there's 800,000 of expenses, $1 million of revenue in. That means there's 200,000 of profit. In the insurance world, that's called underwriting profit. So when a stop loss carrier fronts for a captive, all of those profits go back to the captive.
Okay.
Right? That's an incentive to join a group captive or a captive. They're stripping profits from the carrier. Well, the carrier's not going to do it for free.
Sure.
Because they have shareholders. They're not going to like that.
Yeah, they're not going to lend their underwriting services for free.
So what happens is there's what's called a fronting fee.
Okay.
And that fronting fee is generally 5%, and I've seen it as high as 15% of gross premium.
Okay.
So if the captive members pay $1 million to the fronting carrier takes that cut out immediately.
Okay.
10%, let's say. So that fronting carrier generates 100,000 of money to do the operations that the captive is asking it to do.
Okay.
So the fronting fee is an important number that a consultant needs to look at, because that's to some degree making the captive somewhat operationally more inefficient.
Okay.
And our argument whenever we transition to a direct writer, the alignment of interest.
Yep.
Right? And I always like to say, here, Spencer, here's my checkbook. I need a refrigerator. That refrigerator needs to be four feet deep, 3 feet wide, 6 feet tall. If you have my checkbook, you may meet those specifications, but you may buy a television with a TV in it, right?
Yeah.
For 3 times more than what I was willing to spend. So when stop loss claims come in, the stop loss carrier is really paying those claims with our money.
Yeah.
Right? I'm not suggesting that interests aren't aligned, but we want to make sure that that stop loss claim is the right claim at the right amount, because the money that's paying that stop loss claim is coming out of the client's captive first. There's a level of scrutiny there that we didn't think that the commercial carrier was aligned with us properly.
That's fair. That's fair. And so that fronting fee, is that an administrative fee rather than, because that's not at risk, right? They're taking the fronting fee as an administrator. So is there an element of additional profitability that's their exposure, the carrier, if a commercial carrier is involved or a fronting carrier?
You can have what's called a quota share arrangement.
Okay.
Lots of captives, when we first started, we were 90-10 quota share, which meant our captive, MedTrans, retained 90% of the risk and the carrier retained 10% of the risk. $100,000 claim come in, we paid $90,000, the carrier paid 10. But there's 100% quota shares, meaning the captive is on the hook for 100% of the risk.
Okay, so really at that point, the commercial carrier is just effectively collecting an administrative fee for their services.
That's right.
But there is no exposure. They're not really at risk from a risk transfer perspective.
Correct. And fundamentally, you just have to ask yourself, when someone else is signing my checks, is it all there?
Okay. Well, so I want to make sure I understand this, because I also don't want to just be led to water, right? I want to make sure to understand that. So if that carrier is involved, what is their real role outside of moving money around? I mean, are they really even a stop loss carrier at that point? Like I traditionally think of a stop loss carrier assuming the risk. Like how does that differ?
Yeah, their day-to-day operations differ by no ways.
Okay.
Whether it's a captive or if they sold the policy on their own.
So just eligibility, reimbursement of claims, things like that. Okay.
That's it.
But there's the exposure then is shifted away from that. Because if I'm a direct writer of stop loss at Sun Life and you come to me for a commercial policy as a single employer, I say, hey, here's it costs you $1 million. I assume all of your risk.
That's right.
Okay. So that's interesting. And that's something that I'm kind of wrapping my head around as we go. Questioning, like in that I think you're positioning as a way to question perhaps what the role of that fronting carrier truly ultimately is. So let's table that for now, but I know we'll come back to it. This one I've never heard of before, bordereau report.
Yes.
Newsflash, Phil gave me some terms to use because I don't know what I don't know, but bordereau report, what is that?
So the bordereau.
Did I say that right?
Yes.
Okay, bordereau.
Okay. That's the ingredients to the secret sauce of a captive.
Okay.
And every consultant should be inquiring or looking at the bordereau report.
Okay.
So the bordereau report, in very simple terms, is the accounting of premiums that the carrier receives, and that accounting is being reported to the captive.
Okay.
Because at the end of the day, the captive never touches any of their clients' money until much later in the cycle of insurance, because all of the premiums go to the carrier. Okay? All of the premiums, all the cash go to the carrier. So the carrier accounts for those premiums. They report the costs, the fronting fee costs. Mm-hmm. They report the excess premium costs. They report all of the expenses in the garden variety of expenses of a group captive, and they is illustrated on the bordereau report.
Okay.
So if you want to say how much of my dollar in a group captive is actually used to pay claims, it is expressed on the bordereau report.
Okay, and is this utilized by IRS for accounting purposes, potential audit purposes? Is it proving where the dollars are going? So what is who's reviewing the bordereau report?
The user of the bordereau report is the captive.
Is the captive.
That's
okay.
It.
So it is an internal document.
It goes to the captive manager.
I see. Okay. Yeah. So what makes it so important, though, in your eyes, of why this should have scrutiny or at least be reviewed is just to know where the dollars are flowing? Okay.
I mean, knowing is everything. Yep. Fundamentally, an employer looks at a captive and says, hey, I want more control. That is the common bond of captive participants. I want more control.
Okay.
And what I express tirelessly is when you join a captive, you're investing in that captive. It's not a 2-year investment. It's not even a one. This is a 5-year investment for the employer. And you join a captive, you don't even know what questions to ask until you're already in it, because the jargon is very different.
Yeah, yeah.
So man, it is so important to ask the right questions before you sign on that dotted line.
Yeah, well, and to be fair, right, it's like it's also understanding what questions to ask
Right.
as you go, which, I mean, that's where your consultant, that's where a good captain manager comes in. It's like, hey, we've been through this 100 times before. Full disclosure, these are the things you should consider. I don't think anybody, well, I would hope that anybody's trying to sell an employer on the notion of joining a captain doesn't appreciate kind of the risk that this employer is undertaking, probably their inexperience and potential for exposure to things that they didn't anticipate because they're naive to a degree to come in. I think you should appreciate that this is somebody's business at the end of the day as well, right? And so you realize you're steering them in a direction that's going to have significant impact on their finances, hopefully to the good. So a couple other terms, and then we'll get into, I think, the final kind of half hour of the meat of it is funds withheld. I've heard that thrown around before. What does funds withheld mean?
Yeah, I think this is the simple. This is
the simple. Okay,
yes.
Good, cool.
Who's holding the cash?
Who's holding the cash?
Yep. So the carrier wants to hold the cash. Now, there's always a motivation for that, but there's also an operational ease. For us, it's an operational ease too, because when claims come in, the carrier wants to pay it from one checkbook. Okay. In our model, because we have our structures, like every employer has their own hotel room, and then MedTrans is the hotel, the bricks and mortar. So even though every employer is putting cash in their own hotel room, MedTrans still holds all the cash for the purposes of writing claims.
Okay.
Because I don't want to go to 25 different hotel rooms and say,
knock on the door.
Give me 5,000 here, give me 4,000 there. It just doesn't work. So our reporting pays claims from one checkbook.
Okay. So that's the funds withheld portion. And the last but not least is probably my favorite terms that seems exclusive to the captive world is collateral.
Collateral.
What is collateral?
I like to call it your entrance fee.
Okay.
The rites of passage.
Okay.
Your investment. So within the world of captives, it's a business. A captive is a business. It's an entity. It needs to be capitalized. And in business world, that's called additional paid-in capital.
Okay.
Every business needs to have cash to operate.
Yeah.
And in captives, it's also regulated about how much the captive needs to collect in collateral. And it's usually a function of the premium paid.
Okay.
So if your premium, say $100,000, you're going to pay some percentage of that $100,000. That's the calculation. But what's more important is if I'm in the risk pool, if I'm in the group captive, and someone comes in without paying their entrance fee, are they really vetted? Are they really invested in the success? Because if someone buys into a captive as a transaction, they're not as invested as conceptually, emotionally as I am, because my capital's in the captive, right? So this becomes a real important concept for an employer to say, if you're not all in, we don't want you.
Okay. And you said that collateral is required, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, someone's paying the collateral.
Okay.
Sometimes.
But you said by law there are requirements of how much collateral or capital is there.
The regulators will set the capitalization requirement.
Okay.
Now, the feasibility study that the captive hire outsources to an actuary will have influence on that, and the captive domicile regulator will say, "Yeah, I agree with that."
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
But it's set. They agree to the captive.
You want in, this is what it is.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. But I do appreciate the fact that there's skin in the game, literal skin in the game financially, right? But also it's like, hey, we've all agreed to this. We are all attempting to row in the same direction, right? We're all going to benefit, or that's the idea. So, hey, you want in, there's a membership fee. I'm not going to argue with that. And if it's required, then it is what it is. So that's also something the group needs to understand if they're exploring this as a solution.
Exactly right.
Collateral requirement is going to be a kind of the barrier to entry. So I think that's a nice segue, though. It's like, who is the right type of group? Who It's a good profile of an employer, size, risk appetite. Like what's right for joining the MedTrans captive?
So I think the common bond for all captives, inclusive of group captives, is they want to participate in the risk management.
Okay.
I always like to say this is a participation sport, and it's not a 1 or 2 year sport. It's a 5-year investment.
Okay.
So the employer, generally a type A, generally frustrated with, I'm paying all this insurance premium and I have no measuring stick. to produce a return on investment, because they're in a world of, hey, if my manufacturing system is not working right, I'm going to tweak it here and there. But you can't do that with health insurance effectively. So they join a captive because they want to have more control. They want to be the casino, right? They see all the money go in the insurance company. Insurance companies are always making headline profits.
Sure.
Okay. You could probably go to ask the Google now, and you could have all of that, have the earnings of all these fully insured.
Of course.
So they want a piece of that.
Okay.
So I think that's the common bond. So the type A control freak, what I always like to call. But then the size kind of goes from, 50 employees on the small side. I mean, Medtrans can write down to 20.
Okay.
Sometimes they're not the right group for many different reasons. The group captive will say 50 to 500. But the challenge with a group captive is, if I'm a 500 life employer, I don't necessarily want to be in a risk pool with 50 life groups.
Okay.
Because sometimes the saying, the bucket with the least rocks makes the most noise. With small group, it doesn't take much to really blow a group through their $35,000, $50,000 spec.
Okay.
So a larger group sometimes will get the impression that they're being diluted down in a group captive.
Okay.
With our model, every employer gets their own single parent captive. So the FIFO accounting methodology, an employer with 5,000 lives likes our model. Okay, because they get their own captive. And our risk sharing structure is more favorable to a larger group.
Okay.
And that's the FIFO strategy that we like to deploy.
Okay, so yeah, because I've historically heard that you could kind of age out, right, or size out of a captive at some point. And of course, also that's my training in selling stop loss direct. Partially self-funded. Yeah, well, a partially self-funded group that's 100 lives. Sure, we'll write stop loss for that. So you got to know, though, there is historically, again, speaking, size out seems more common than being too small. So what's the opposite end of the spectrum? You said kind of 20, depending on the employer. Why is there a minimum requirement for a group size as well?
What I always like to say is by statute, I mean, in our captive domicile, our regulator says, no, we want 20 lives.
Okay.
If you go below that, you're really your specific deductible is so low, it takes on the image of fully insured.
Okay.
So, but some smaller employers just lack sophistication and the expertise in the risk financing world.
Okay.
And that's no disrespect to the smaller employers, but the CEO has multiple roles in that corporation, right? And it's not always, they don't have necessarily the bandwidth on the risk financing side.
Okay. Well, that makes sense. And so, we were talking scrutiny, I think, a minute ago, or, kind of some of the regulations, kind of the visibility from an IRS perspective. What I'm hearing about that to a degree. So what do I need to know? Or what does the audience need to know about things to be aware of from a regulation or scrutiny standpoint?
Yeah. So the IRS has Section 831 of the Internal Revenue Code. And by default, insurance companies, inclusive of captives, by default go to what's called 831A.
Okay.
And an 831A means it's a C corporation, and they're taxed on income.
Okay.
So the current C corp tax rate is 21%, and that means if I bring in $1 million, I have $800,000 of expenses, I've got $200,000 of profit. That profit is taxed at 21%. Okay. So 831A is the default. Many years back, Congress enacted a new additional option for smaller captives. And the motivation for that is, hey, we want to encourage smaller employers to be more engaged in the art of self-funding, because it's always more expensive, always better for an employer to pay their claims from their checkbook as compared to having an insurance company pay it for them. Because the second I have an insurance company pay my claim, my dollar claim really costs the insurance company $1.20 because of the inherent expenses of that corporation, of that insurance company. So there's an election that's 831B, and that's for micro captives. And that 831B election has been abused.
Okay.
and it's been abused a lot, and the IRS is pushing back.
So 2 follow-ups. So what makes it a micro captive then? When you say micro, is there a certain size that becomes a micro?
Yes.
Okay.
So in order to qualify for that election, you have to collect less than $2.3 million of policy premium.
Okay.
That's just stop-loss premium in our example.
Okay.
Okay.
In total?
In total.
Okay.
Every single year.
Okay, so micro, so that you can qualify for an 831B, but what type of abuses then are we seeing, what the IRS doesn't like?
Yes, so think of an insurance company, a captive, like a stool, a footstool.
Okay.
The surface of that footstool is the captive.
Okay.
And it has 3 legs to it. And the courts have come back and they say, if one of those legs isn't there, the whole insurance facility collapses.
Okay.
Okay. And the abuse on the 831B side really stems from what's called enterprise risk policies. And enterprise risk policies, they're essentially policies that loss of key supplier,
okay,
loss of key employee. So arguably, those are business risks. If you lose your CFO, is that really a fortuitous risk, right? Did you have control of that? Maybe, maybe not. So in the enterprise risk space, the employer was making the claims against their captive.
Okay.
That's a very vital discussion here, and it's a differentiator. So if I'm the employer, I'm buying, let's say, $100,000 of loss of key supplier insurance, and I'm putting that money into my captive. I'm taking the deduction of that $100,000 and putting it into my captive, and that money sits there.
Okay.
If I have a claim against one of my policies, I could file a claim against my captive. Well, what came into question is the 831B trying to make it more advantageous for smaller businesses. The 831B says the revenue on my micro captive is not taxed on income. Okay? So the challenge here, the IRS says, no, wait a minute, Spencer. You could have filed a supply chain disruption claim, but you chose not to. Mm-hmm. And the reason you chose not to, because you're trying to preserve that captive, which is tax advantaged.
Mm-hmm.
Advantaged.
Okay.
So in our model, each single parent captive can elect 831B if they want to.
Okay.
It's their discretion. And we are the watchdogs of that because we apply the 3-legged test. The policies are fortuitous, meaning it's the employees driving the claim.
Okay.
It's not the employer. Spencer, you broke your leg. You're a $60,000 claim. You're a $10,000 stop loss claimant, not the employer.
Okay.
That's the first thing. So it's not anywhere close to a business risk. It's fortuitous. Okay. Then there's the other leg of policy pricing. Now, in our model, there's incentive to say, boy, let me take $1 million of profits from my corporation and buy $1 million worth of...
I think I already knew you're going with this, right?
Yes.
So, yeah, overpricing.
Overpricing policies. Yeah. We don't do that. We have an outside actuary that prices all of our plans, all of our stop-loss policies, and that's what's called an arm's length transaction.
Okay.
So our policy pricing comes from someone who has not vested in the interest of the captive. So, and it's funny because policy pricing is really a cultural indicator from us, because sometimes an employer will say, Phil, I like that $100,000 policy. I love it at $90,000. Mm-hmm. Can you get the $90,000? And that's where I kind of say, Spencer, I'm not sure you're ready for this, man.
Yeah.
Because if I underprice you by $10,000, guess what? I'm now shifting risk to all of the risk pool participants, and they would fire me on that if I did that. So I'm never going to do that. So policy pricing. The third leg are claims. Stop loss are our claims. You can't get away from that. Mm-hmm. So you may go 2 or 3 years with never filing a stop loss claim, but you will, what I always like to say, 2 or 3 years out of every 5 to 7 are bad years.
Yeah.
And that holds true with us. So even if you have no claims, you're still paying someone else's claims within our risk pool to some degree. So our three-legged stool test, it's very solid, right? Because we don't want to run afoul of that.
Well, and that's what, like, I kind of brought that question up, and I think it's a common perhaps objection or somebody trying to pick apart the notion of a captive is some of the less scrupulous things that are done in this space taints the notion of a captive, right? And I completely appreciate that. So just kind of understanding, right? You are still towing a line. You talked about type A employers. You're still towing a line of what you can, I don't say get away with, but what within the constraints of the law are appropriate or not. And sometimes I realize there could be a gray area in that regard, and which is somebody leans on you to steer them clear of that too much gray.
Yep.
Yeah. Yep. Is that safe to say? Okay.
It is safe to say, because at the end of the day, the 831B election, that those captives within our risk pool, not all of them elected B, some of them elected A, okay? But of those that are in the risk pool that elected B, they're not taxed on their profit. So every business makes a buying decision based on what? What's in it for my business? Spencer, I love you, but I don't really care about your business.
Fair enough.
In a group captive, there's no me, there's us.
Okay.
And that was a distinction and a motivation that changed our structure, because our members said, man, I am doing everything possible to mitigate my severity risk, okay? But this guy down the road, he's not doing it as good, or he doesn't really care. He's just writing the checks and saying, hey, I'm in a captive. I get to go to Hawaii for my board meetings. I mean, it's the truth.
It's enough. That's enough of a draw probably for some people.
So the motivation has to be self-servant. So if I'm the employer and there's $200,000 of stop loss premium in my captive, I am very aware of every claim that is paid out of my captive. I want to make sure that that $10,000 stop loss claim is a legitimate claim, right?
Yeah.
Because it's my money. And if I can intervene, and let's say I can save $10,000 of stop loss claim payment, well, I'm not taxed on that income. And that's a lever. That's an operational lever of efficiency, because a group captive collects more than $2.3 million. So if a group captive, say, has $100 million of premium and there's $80 million of expenses and claims, $20 million of profit, they're paying the IRS $4 million of that. So that $4 million we can keep in our risk pool for efficiency.
And I suppose future expenses, right? Or
correct. It carries forward.
Right? Right.
Yeah. So over the years, you can put that profit to work to lower your stop loss rates, to offset your premiums. At the end of the day, you're benefiting the employees because the cost of care, cost of insurance is less.
Makes sense. Okay, I'm coming around, Phil. I'm coming around. So let's kind of get to. I think we have maybe 10 more minutes left. I want to make sure conscientious of the time in the studio here as well. But this has been fascinating. Just so you know, transparency, right? It sounds like there's a lot of alignment and focus on transparency. Really, what even that Bordereau report, I suppose, is a radical notion of transparency. So talk to me how that applies in this space, making the expenses more apparent or transparent, the claims payments more transparent. Is it safe to say transparency is one of those pillars of a captive?
That is entirely our mission.
Okay.
MedTrans is 100% owned by the members. So the employer owns their own hotel room, and then that hotel room has a share of the risk pool, which is the hotel.
Okay.
So I'm a service provider. And what I always like to say is, if I don't do my job, I can be fired. So our members democratically elect the board of directors.
Okay.
We have various committees, like an underwriting committee, a finance committee, an executive committee. Those are all levels of checks and balances. But every dollar is accounted for. And it's that transparency that we subscribe to. That's the root of why an employer does this with us.
Well, I presume the employer buys into the transparency for themselves as well, right? Like you talked about a collateral as a barrier to entry, but I assume you can't just be like, oh no, I'm not going to share with the group. What level do you have to stop at though with HIPAA, where you cannot share certain information? Is there, I mean, like so-and-so employer had a claim, but you don't know it was Debbie with cancer and the outcome. Okay, so HIPAA still applies, right? But I presume, and I think one of the notions that I understand about a captive is kind of a sharing of best in practices and, hey, you're doing this. Well, how's that? Tell me about that. How's that work? Maybe I can do that. Like, is there a lot of that proactive sharing of?
It's a breeding ground of that.
Okay.
So MedTrans has an annual meeting at the end of the first quarter.
That's the Savannah one.
Savannah.
Right? Yes.
So the reason for that meeting is collaboration, because good ideas spread like wildfire in our program. And what I always like to say is, I don't know if I have the best PBM in place today. I think I do. But if a new consultant brings in a new option, guess what? That's gonna go to everybody because our members talk.
Yeah.
Right? So it's important, the collaboration, the fraternal feel is very important.
That's what it sounds like. That's what I kind of always got this outsider's perspective of, is like, you talked about the annual conferences or biannual, however they may be, but it's kind of interesting, especially even with folks that are kind of in the homogenous type captive where they potentially are competitors to a degree, right? But still sharing best practices about how to run your operation or how to save money on claims. I can appreciate that, right? You can still compete head to head on what product or service you sell, but they're helping each other manage the claims, because I think everybody in that captive, of course, benefits from that. That's different. That's refreshing to kind of hear of competitors perhaps even sharing with one another and helping one another, which is kind of interesting.
Because they're in the same risk pool.
Yeah.
If Joe over there needs help on controlling some of their severity costs, then Sally wants to help them, because Joe's going to be diluting Sally's profits potentially.
Yeah. It's almost like, hey, you're affecting me, so get on the on the train, man. So kind of future of this. I generally I ask folks like what the future of the industry, but I'd rather hear your perspective, kind of the future of the captive industry at large. You said you guys have shifted, right? You shifted towards the single parent style of captive. What's kind of the next iteration of captives? Do you see something on the horizon that changes your space at all?
Oh boy. By and large, the space is growing fast.
Okay.
And that's evident by the number of group captives that are coming into the market, the amount of private equity that's coming into the market. So we think that this is primed for growth. And we had this conversation earlier. Is there a maximum size, right? And in our model, not really, because our hotel room, I jokingly say each floor could be like its own vertical.
Okay.
Oxymoron.
Yeah.
But the manufacturers all have one floor of our program. The lawyers and professional services have another floor. Those could be like risk pools.
Okay.
So our model is scalable, and that was by design, because we want our members to be accountable for their own risks, and we want to give them the tools for that.
Well, and one of the things we talked about over lunch that I think is a shift that you told me that I was unaware of is the domiciling offshore versus onshoring it back. So you're saying it's less prevalent nowadays to offshore your domicile, correct?
Yes.
What was the reason for that?
Yeah, there's really no reason to go offshore. There once was a reason, but with the Trump tax, event in 2017, I think.
Yeah, what was that to encourage was it a repatriation of funds or whatever? I forgot the terminology that was used to get people to take their cash that's sitting over here and bring it back to the States because of they were worried about corporate taxes or something. Okay, yeah, I remember that.
And if your captive is already doing business offshore, it's a very costly event to bring that onshore.
Okay.
And offshore is not bad. It's still a very reasonable thing to do. It's just the incentive is no longer there.
Okay, unless you like trips to the Cayman Islands, correct? Yeah, who doesn't like a trip to the Caymans? Yeah.
Yes.
Every year as well, right? Every year. So kind of last but not least, man, I want to wrap it up. We went deep in the jargon, and this is by design. This is a technical product that's not for a technical solution, I should say, that's not for everybody. But summarize, if you will, for the audience, what do we need to leave them with? Like, what are things to consider? Of course, we want to be able to have them reach out to you and talk about that at the very end. But what do you want to leave just people that you want to emphasize of importance?
Yeah, I think our history of being a group captive fronted by a carrier, the lessons learned from that got us to where we are today.
Okay.
And I'm a professor of efficiency and transparency. I want to leverage everything that I possibly can for the benefit of the client. And the group captive model and our direct writer model share the common bond of employers that just want to have more control. Mm-hmm. They want to take an ownership stake into a captive that will pay dividends at some point in the future.
Okay.
Those dividends are the rewards for effectively participating in your second or third highest cost of your business. Mm-hmm. You have to get involved. And if you're not involved, you're probably not welcome.
Yeah, and it's just, I mean, people that want control, right?
Yes.
People want a willingness to participate, and the skin in the game element, I think, is something that's really unique that I appreciate about this as well. So where should folks, or how should folks get a hold of you if they have more interest in talking about captives?
Well, I can be reached on my cell phone, my office phone. Our website is completecaptive.com.
Okay.
So Complete Captive Management Services is the captive management firm.
Okay.
We've got a LinkedIn page. We've got, our website, completecaptive.com. MedTrans Insurance is the name of the captive.
Okay.
So you can go to LinkedIn, look up MedTrans. You can go to medtransltd.com.
Okay. And then reach out. So Phil, I know we didn't say it up front. I'll obviously have your name across the beginning, but so can you spell Holowka for the audience as well? Yes.
It's Holowka. You got to break it up into 3 syllables. And
Holowka. Awesome, man. Well, so Phil, it's been a pleasure, man. I really appreciate you making time for this on your schedule. It's very good to see. We bumped into each other at SIA, which was a nice surprise as well. But thank you for this. This is something that I think is going to be helpful for me. Mm-hmm. Hopefully it's helpful for the audience. I think this is a space that deserves some time to flesh out the conversation and does not necessarily fit in a 30 or 90-second soundbite, which might make it a little difficult to come up with a clip for this, but I think that's okay, right? If you're, like you said, if you're buying into this idea, it's a 5-year play. There's going to be a lot of education around it. It's not a reaction to a bad renewal necessarily. There's a lot more to it than that, and so you need somebody you can trust and explain it to you.
We want to give our clients the tools to invest in themselves. And I will and I will give you as many kudos as possible because you're doing good work in this space.
Thanks, man. Well, you are as well. So I appreciate you, Phil. Maybe a couple months down the line we'll have you back for a round 2.
Be delighted.
All right.
Thank you,
man.